We are very grateful that you have chosen to share some of your busy day with us. We know that your time is valuable, and we will honor that today with what I'm confident will be an engaging 60 minutes or so of discussion. Once again, our topic today is the journey of a stolen check, exposing the fraud ecosystem. Our sponsor today is Mitek. Our host today is American Banker. My name is Mike Sisk. I'm a contributing editor at American Banker, and I will be your moderator today. And my articles have also appeared in Barron's, Crane's New York Business, Inc., Institutional Investor, Strategy and Business, and Worth. And I am very, very pleased to introduce our two speakers today. James Watts is Senior Manager, Product Management at Mitek, and Cam Sterner is Intelligence and Analyst Manager at Dark Tower. So we're really, really very, very pleased to have both gentlemen with us here today. And just before we jump into things, I wanted to reiterate two little quick points that were in that intro video, that we do have time at the end for Q&A. You don't have to wait until the end to put your question into the queue. You can do that throughout the hour as the question occurs to you, and we encourage you to get that question in there. We'd love to hear from you. And if we run out of time, we don't get to the question, we will definitely follow up after the program. So please ask away. As I said, we very much want to hear from you. And we also have a couple polls today, and I always encourage 100% participation because we do share the results live with everyone here today, and it's a really great way for everyone to see where other folks stand on the issue that we've come together to discuss. So if you can weigh in on that poll, that would be fantastic. And so today we're going to have a good back and forth discussion. I'll be asking James and Cam a couple questions. But first, James, if I could ask you to sort of set the stage for our discussion today, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. So, we've all heard the adage that checks are dead or dying. Obviously, they're still around. They're going to be a while. They're still extremely popular for businesses to pay other businesses. In fact, one of the last studies that came out said that 80% of businesses still make check payments as their primary payment method. So they're out there. What this causes, though, because checks as a payment vehicle hasn't changed much over the last couple decades, it means it's ripe for fraud. With interception of mail, synthetic accounts, drop accounts, there's so many different ways to attack the payment rails that it just makes the opportunity there for the fraudsters, which really drives the spike in check fraud that we're seeing today, which we'll talk about as we get more into the webinar here. Just to kind of give you an idea, in 2022 alone, there was an 84% increase of instances of check fraud. And this year, check fraud losses are predicted to hit $24 billion by the end of the year.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, good. Thank you for that context. And I think that brings us to our first poll. Is that right? Is that right, James? I think so. Okay, cool. Wonderful. All right, good. So basically, the way I'm just going to read the question here. I'm going to read through the couple possible answers, and hopefully that gives everyone about enough time to answer the question here. So what type of fraud is top of mind for you right now, or for your financial institution? Is it check fraud? Is it account takeover, phishing, or account opening fraud? And so let me just kind of hold this open a few moments before we move on to sort of collect a good sampling of our audience, kind of what's on their mind, kind of a nice way to sort of set the stage here for the rest of our discussion. Yeah, great. So I've actually got a handy little tool down here that lets me see the number of folks that are participating. So I'm very very pleased with the number of folks that are participating here. So I think that is actually a good, very nice group here. Let's go ahead and show the results. Awesome. So here we go. Check fraud, 54.8%, leading the way here. Phishing, 17.5%. Account takeover, 15.2%. Yeah, thanks everyone for that feedback. James, what are your thoughts here? Is this kind of what you expected to see?
This is completely in line with what we're expected to see. As it's on top of mind now for the first time in a lot of years for financial institutions across the U.S.
Yeah. Okay, good. So let me, with that as sort of a background, or it's kind of setting here, let's just kind of jump into the question. So James, let me stick with you for a moment. We all know that there's been this significant increase in check fraud. Can you tell us some of the methods currently being used to steal checks?
Yeah, one of the biggest drivers in check fraud is actually mail theft. And the United States Postal Service is literally under attack, from their letter carriers being robbed at gunpoint to beaten, even to the fishing for within a blue collection box where they can make those economy of scales of mail theft. What the main goal of these thefts are what are called arrow keys, and these are literally think of them as the keys to the kingdom for the Postal Service. They could service all of the bulk collection sites within a neighborhood to as far as multiple zip codes. So one of these keys can provide thieves access to a lot of mail at a very short period of time. When that goes on to the fraud ecosystem, stolen checks will typically fetch these guys anywhere from $175 to $250 per check. Again, what we're seeing is there's a 161% increase of mail theft complaints, which is roughly about 300,000 complaints.
Yeah, James, I was shocked to hear recently about that key, that the kind of one stolen key can open so many boxes.
Yeah, and depending on what type of metro area or what type of area they're in, again, it could be limited to a neighborhood, or it could be multiple zip codes that one key covers.
Interesting. Hey, so Cam, have you found, is mail theft concentrated in one region of the U.S.? And are there different? What about like different types of check theft?
Yeah, so as James said, check fraud and checks as a whole are not dead. And the fact of the matter is, anywhere checks are used and mailboxes exist, check fraud can take place. And I don't mean to fearmonger, but for those keeping track, that's pretty much everywhere. Now, that being said, we do have evidence to suggest that it is taking place in more concentrated areas. So, for example, the Philadelphia metropolitan area or specific zip codes surrounding Miami. It depends on where keys are being stolen, and obviously bigger city areas with more people means more people to join networks. An interesting thing is, on notes such as unemployment fraud that are for specific states, Michigan unemployment fraud that involves checks for cash out are really only going to take place in Michigan. So that's a good state by state, area by area example. Another thing that we observe is the methods behind check fraud having regional sort of senses. So, for example, you can see on that image there an arrow key that is being advertised. One thing that we noted over at DT was arrow key advertisements on the East Coast were primarily happening in Telegram fraud groups. So if you were on the East Coast and you wanted to buy an arrow key for a zip code near you, you would go to Telegram. But if you were on the West Coast, almost all of these advertisements for a time last year were taking place on TikTok. So not only is check theft a regional issue, but the methods behind it are stunningly regional.
Wow, really interesting. Thank you, Cam. All right, let's do our next poll now, actually. Let's move on to that next poll, please. So once again, let me just read through the question and the answers here, and hopefully that'll give folks plenty of time to answer. How much of an increase in check fraud has your financial institution seen in the past year? 0 to 25% increase, a 26 to 50% increase, 51 to 75, more than 75, or you're not sure? And this will be really interesting to see, kind of given the statistics that James was sharing before about the overall increase that we've seen over the last year. So I'm going to hold this open another couple of moments. But yeah, really fascinating topic. Okay, good. I'm just going to hold this open one last moment. Really want to get a good reading here. Okay, let's go ahead and share these results. And all right, so 26 to 50% increase, 24.3, and then 51 to 75, 10.5, and 75 plus 6.1. So, these are pretty big numbers. Would you agree, Cam, that these are pretty big numbers?
I mean, if we're just going on a number standpoint, I think anything over 0 is too big of a number.
Agreed. Okay, fantastic. All right, now with that, thank you everyone for that polling, and let's just move on to this next question that I'd like to let me I'm going to put the question out there and then start with James. So there's obviously kind of an ecosystem when it comes to stolen checks, and it's typically not just one person who's involved. And so it'd be really interesting at this point if you could explain this ecosystem and who plays in it. My understanding is we've got sort of 4 main profiles of players here, but James, maybe you could start a little bit of a description about how this ecosystem is kind of put together.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. It is an ecosystem, and it's now being approached as fraud as a business. So there's a market for it, and there's a market for each of these players. There's networks, and they're all interconnected. But it all starts with the initial perpetrator, right? And this is the person that is actually out there stealing the mail, whether through arrow keys or going fishing in collection boxes or just raiding mailboxes at home. As Cam said, anywhere there's checks and anywhere there's financial documents and there's a mailbox, it's a right target. So they obtain the actual check document and, of course, all the accompanying PII information that's included, along with other stolen mail items, whether that's credit card, debit cards, statements, anything that can provide value to them. From there, they use that information to either sell it to a broker, so think a wholesaler, who actually has the network and is selling these in bulk, or they'll use it to commit other fraud like ATM skimming, phishing, or social engineering scams, even in hacking into different financial databases or accounts to take over. So when you think about this, and if you think about the ecosystem, it has to have a network to work, or there has to be a market for it to exist. So the broker is the next step of that, and that's the one that establishes that network, and some even provide a matchmaking service to the other players of it, to forgers, mules, even initial perpetrators, bringing them together.
So who are these middlemen? I mean, is there any kind of profile for them?
Typically, it depends on the region of it is, and I'll let Cam get into the specifics on that. Okay. They seem to be very regionally focused on how they operate, whether they're part of an organized crime group or it's just a singularly established network.
Gotcha. Cam, yeah, I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on the other 2 main players in this ecosystem. For instance, the forger.
Yeah, so the thing about the forger is they'll go in and they'll obtain checks from these networks, and these networks can be anywhere from 200,000 members to 300 with, as many checks as you could dream of in them. And to be honest, buying these checks from these groups as the forger can be as easy as buying something off of Amazon. I mean, you pick your desired Facebook, Telegram, dark web marketplace. You go in, you do a little window shopping for a check that you want. You message the leader of a network, or sometimes they have an automated system. You'll pay, often in a cryptocurrency, and then you have a check on your way. Once the forger has that check, it's up to them to alter it. And, the method that I'm sure we're all already aware of is washing. This is physically altering a check with chemicals to change the ink. But as technology has changed everything about the fraud landscape, we're noticing the new method that they are calling cooking, which is digitally altering the check so that they can use it as a seed check. The thing about cooking is these fraudsters are often not very smart and not very good at it. There's a lot of room for error with digitally altering. So, for example, a check that was circulating from the Phoenix area had Phoenix spelled wrong on it. And FIs were instantly able to identify this network of checks that had the exact same misspelling on all of them. Fraud actors are often not as smart as we make them out to be. But once they have the check, yeah, it's about cooking.
Interesting. And are there, besides cooking, are there other? What are the next steps, sort of in altering or counterfeiting checks? Is there something beyond that, or?
James, if you want to speak to any other method outside of cooking, but cooking and washing are really the two tried and trues that we're observing in the fraud marketplaces. And the thing about the forger is it's probably the least public of the roles, right? The most public being the broker. So we get I think the least window into what exactly the forgers are doing, unless they're advertising their services in these fraud networks.
Yeah, and as an editor, I find it just amazing that someone could go through all this trouble and then just misspell the city name.
There's more egregious cases.
It's like dropping the ball on the 1 yard line or something. So what about the money mule? Who is it that's actually cashing or depositing forged checks?
The money mule is absolutely the most interesting part of this chain to me, because from what we see, the mules can be either willing or unwilling. In these sort of fraud networks, these massive Telegram and Facebook groups, in the same way they advertise stolen checks, they'll advertise roles for people to cash them, often for a split of the profit of the check. So they'll be working directly with other people in the network. So we call these recruitment posts. We see them on Facebook. We see them on Telegram. We see them everywhere, and they're just another extension of building out the network. Unfortunately, it's not always quite like that, and oftentimes mules are the victim of another type of fraud. So it could be an employment scam where their new boss is asking them to cash a check, or they're the victim of a romance scam, and this has been going on for a long time, and they've been doing this from someone overseas for a very long time. But once they have a mule, whether it's willing or unwilling, they'll often do it at an ATM over a mobile deposit. A cooked check is far more likely to pass an ATM's image verification as opposed to a mobile deposit. Or another thing we see, and this is less frequent but more dangerous, is we'll see the advertisements of an innie or an insider. This is someone that is working at a financial institution, has a direct connection to someone in the fraud network, and is willingly doing these deposits.
And
Wow.
Cam, to add to that, what I would say on the money mules, you hit an interesting part when you said unwilling money mules. What we find is when you boil down a lot of the scams that are out there, it involves the influx on the check payment rails and then the outflux on a real-time payment to capture those illicit funds before the check clears. So you have that interconnectivity that makes it difficult to track and adds a layer of complexity for investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So is that one of the things that sort of these sort of complex transactions sort of obscure the paper trail, essentially?
Absolutely. And just to kind of give a little scope to size of these networks or what they can be, we conducted a test on stolen check images that we found, and we found that each document that ends up for sale generates about $50,000 in loss per document, per check. So that check may be only written for $100, but it's going to cause on average about $50,000 of loss.
Wow.
And further, kind of give you another example, we did a test for one financial institution, and we found $10 million of potential loss liability on just one marketplace. And as Cam said, that is a tiny fraction of the ecosystem that exists out there.
Fascinating. All right. Excellent. So I think that brings us to our next poll. Kind of a follow-up question on this, on what we've just been discussing here. Which of the 4 bad actors do you think is the hardest to catch? The initial perpetrator, the broker, the forger, or the money mule? So let me just leave that open for a couple moments. Let people weigh in on that. Yeah, this whole discussion is hitting home for me. My brother-in-law recently had a check stolen and cashed at a bank. Someone walked in with the information, and they cut a cashier's check. And
that story is not unsurprising. I think most everybody has somebody or knows somebody that has happened to, and we see headlines every day about people and businesses out tens of thousands of dollars. So the impact to the consumer is absolutely, felt.
Yeah. All right, good. Let's go ahead and share these results at this point. We got a nice selection here. All right, so pretty spread here. We got the forger 34.2 was the hardest to catch. followed by the broker, and then the initial perpetrator. What do you think about that, James? Does that seem about right to you, or is that a kind of a surprise?
No, that's actually right on. I mean, all of the players are hard to catch just because of the way that the ecosystem works. However, the broker and the forger are the two that do most of their work, as Cam said too, least publicly. So they have more anonymity behind them. They're not on the front line like the money mule, where there's a lot of personal risk, and they're not as active as the initial perpetrator. So that's right in line.
And on the roles of the broker and the forger, which I'd agree those are the two hardest to pin down. It really depends what platform they're on. Telegram, people are far less inclined to have PII tied to their accounts on Telegram, and it can make it very difficult to pin down who is the broker behind the network. Whereas on Facebook groups, and like I said, this is where it really depends on what platform you're on, it's far more likely that they are using a personal account to facilitate this, especially if it's a regional-based network, in which case you can find out what their mother's maiden name and favorite food is if you spend enough time looking.
So Cam, let me stick with you for this next question. So now that we know the players and the roles they play, what happens with the stolen checks? Like, how are fraudsters using the stolen checks and the data that they find on them?
Yeah, so James, you might want to speak more to this, but the one thing that we are seeing is it can be used as a seed. So I saw a question about how can a $100 check get turned into $50,000 of losses. The check gets replicated and spread about.
Not only that, it's not just the check itself that's valuable. It's the data that's on the check as well, because you've got name, you've got address, and believe it or not, you have sometimes social security numbers printed on checks. You've got telephone numbers, you've got routing and account numbers. There's a lot of additional information that fraudsters can use to spread out the type of fraud that they're committing.
And it sounds like from what we've talked so far that there are many criminal marketplaces out there for the bad guys to sort of tap into for this information. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we're just scratching the surface on how many are truly out there. I mean, you can have a look at the images on screen right now. 20,000 members. I believe that says almost 70,000 members. That is not uncommon. There are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of these groups. For example, I was syncing up with the Mitek folks yesterday, and this wasn't even an example I had pulled out. This was just what was on my screen on my work laptop. I was looking into a Telegram group with only 300 members in it. It had 11,000 unique images in it, every single one a unique check. That's not accounting, what the dollar value of that, how many FIs are impacted. And that's a group with 300 members. And there are groups that can go up to 200,000 members, both on Facebook and Telegram. And that's not even accounting the groups that aren't super blatant about it. I mean, the groups up there are called spammers, and we see groups that are like check fraud here, and it's really easy to pinpoint what those groups are doing. But, we've looked into groups that pose as legitimate businesses or legitimate groups, and until you join those private groups, you would never even know that there's check fraud going on in them.
Wow. You mentioned, I think James just mentioned the fact like some checks even have a social security on them. I mean, are there certain stolen checks that can be sold for a higher price than others? I mean,
sorry, go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, so there's some interesting examples with this, some that most people might not even think of. The one that comes to my mind that really makes me think is political donations, right? So I spent a lot of time working on local political campaigns, particularly in the combating donation fraud realm. And the thing about when you donate to a political campaign is that political campaign will now never leave you alone for the rest of your life. They will bombard you with further donation requests and follow-ups and emails and phone numbers until you die, and sometimes after you die. So it's honestly a relief when you donate to a political campaign and they don't continue to hound you. Fraud actors realize this, and when they steal a political check, a check that's addressed to a political candidate, how are most people ever going to realize that that check was stolen? It's not like sending in a medical bill where if that doesn't get through, you'll know. So that's a really interesting part. The other thing is large dollar amount checks that you can use to open a fake business with. So I saw a question about this in chat, and we've observed the case with a guy by the name of Huncho Neal, who was advertising on his Facebook that he had a $84,000 check that he had stolen addressed to Amazon Web Services. So this isn't an official poll, but I'm going to ask the audience, do you think he, A, returned that check like a good Samaritan, or B, founded a business called Amazon Web Services, Inc. of Alabama and cashed that check and then proceeded to brag about it on Facebook? I don't think you guys need to think too hard on which one he did, but that was the case. Treasury checks that are more likely to clear because they can't put a 14-day hold on them, and then small business checks are some examples. James, if you've anything to add to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, the business checks definitely seem to fetch a higher price just because those accounts are typically well funded. On the flip side, unless they've got, additional products from their financial institution or are really on top of things, the fraud will go unnoticed a lot longer in those situations, because these are typically businesses that are writing a lot of checks. There's a lot of checks coming through, and they may not get reconciled till the end of every month or end of every quarter. So you have that delay where more fraud can get through and they take a higher loss. And then you also, Cam, mentioned the fact about the innies, right? So you have these insiders that are working at financial institutions that are basically providing the loopholes to the forgers and the money mules on how to get around their currently implemented fraud strategy.
So James, I think you may have already talked about kind of the average, that how much money one stolen check can net. But I'm also curious, what does this impact have on the victim itself, and kind of what does it mean for the bank in terms of making them whole?
Absolutely. So going back to the whole check payments being a legacy, haven't changed much in 20 years. Neither have the regulations. So what you find is it's not like when fraud happens on your credit or debit cards, you have that zero liability, and there's a set quick turnaround time for the customer to be made whole. On the checks, it's not like that. So there can be really drawn out, long processes, fights with their financial institution on getting made whole, which can take months, if they're even made whole. And that's also because on the back end, the claim process for fraudulent or breach of warranty in the check world is an archaic and manual process and takes forever. So if one financial institution is fighting with another financial institution over who actually owns the liability for that loss, at the end of the day, the customer is the one that is affected by it. And that can cause a lot of reputational risk for the financial institution, but even further for the customer. I saw the Identity Theft Resource Center put out a consumer impact study for 2023, and in their study they put out that customers who had identity theft or had fraud committed upon them actually had suicidal thoughts at 3 times higher than the national average. So it doesn't just affect the financial well-being, but it's actually affecting consumers' well-being overall.
Wow. Wow, dramatic. So with regards to the data on the stolen check, can it be used, for other forms of fraud?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
with depending on the information that you got, that could be used to fund synthetic identities. It can be used to create fake accounts, open new credit lines. So it's not just a straight action of the check fraud, the check being washed, money coming out of the account. You now have this spider web of different types of fraud that can just exponentially explode. Because the other side of that, as you think about it, as a broker, when they're selling this check, these are fraudsters we're talking about. So they're selling that to multiple persons. So it's not even just the paper document anymore, like Cam said, it's the image itself. So yeah, it's used as a springboard for pretty much most types of financial fraud.
You'll even see more savvy threat actors, the ones who are behind the networks, blurring out or crossing out certain information on checks before they advertise them, so as they can't be used by anyone who's just perusing through their sites. You have to purchase them first. Yeah. So that it proves that information does have a pretty strong monetary value.
Interesting. So kind of going back a little bit to the question about seeking, if you're a victim of the fraud, kind of seeking justice, like, are there criminal charges and penalties for the perpetrators? What are the legal, options or challenges for victims that are sort of seeking to kind of resolve these issues and get some justice? James, we'll start with you on that one.
Right now, I mean, one of the biggest things is just the time it takes to investigate and provide a resolution to the fraud, from even starting with the financial institution side of things. When they get a check fraud claim in, it takes time to investigate. It's a very intense, labor-intensive, proposition. But then it's also coordinating with the law enforcement and other investigative institutions that need to be involved, where there isn't always that connection. Cam, I'm sure you have something to add on that.
Yeah, so another thing I wanted to say in regards to the difficulties is some of these actors aren't even based in the United States, which gives obviously law enforcement yet another hurdle on a long list of hurdles on actually stopping the guys who are behind these networks. The mules and the people on the ground, the people who are robbing postal service workers, are likely based in the United States, but some of the masterminds behind all of these who are keeping these trends going are out of our reach altogether.
Interesting. All right, let's do our next poll. Let's put that up there now. Awesome, thank you. So, what are the top ways to stay ahead of check fraud? Would you say that it's monitoring the dark web, better locks on mailboxes, sharing fraud data between financial institutions, or utilize AI automation and other advanced technology? So let's once again, let's hold this up for another few moments to get. These are all really interesting polling questions, and I'm kind of fascinated to see where people land on these different questions. And I appreciate everyone in the audience. We're really getting great participation in these polls, and it really does, I think, make for a nice. Well, they're more accurate for starters, and it's just it's a nice thing to be able to share with everyone here with us to sort of see where everyone stands. All right, good. Hold it up just another moment, and okay, let's go ahead and share these results, please. And okay, so automation, utilize AI, automation, other advanced technologies, 50%, and 45 say sharing fraud data between financial institutions. So not too many people are betting on better lock boxes, better locks for the mailboxes. Cam, what do you think of these results?
Is it a cop-out to say all of them would be good? If we just want to go down the list here. So from monitoring the dark web, I think this is important because we keep an eye on what the current trends are. It's not just about that the theft is happening. We need to know how it's evolving. And it is constantly evolving as new safeguards get in place. So I think keeping an eye on the dark web not only helps us scrape for stolen checks so that we can, report them to FIs and make sure consumers aren't losing their money, but so that we can also see where people are advertising, where the check fraud is really happening. So dark web, Telegram, Facebook, wherever it may be, I do think monitoring the networks is important. Better locks on mailboxes. I know there is the common argument that surveillance doesn't really deter, but a better lock can't hurt. We know that a lot of the origin of this theft is people breaking into boxes and stealing mail. So whether it's a huge deterrence or not, I think it can't hurt. Sharing fraud data between financial institutions is my personal top pick, largely because I like to look at this issue as a regional one as opposed to an FI-based one. If there is a batch of checks stolen from, say, my home city, Philadelphia, I would want people to be looking at all of them so they can analyze the larger data set. Obviously, FIs are going to dictate towards their actual customers, and that makes sense. I get it. But I think we, as a whole collective of people who are fighting this, need to look at it as a regional problem. So I really like the sharing fraud data answer. And obviously, there's the point to, as technology gets better, the fraudsters are only going to get better, continually. That's why check fraud is up. It's because they're getting better and better methods to do this. So I think we need to fight fire with fire. I think we need to use AI, automation, OCR, any technology at our disposal to ensure that we're stopping fraud.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, so let's take a look at this next slide. And Cam, I wanted to sort of just get your take on this this slide and kind of what what the implications are?
I think this is fascinating to me because I'm a younger guy, and to be honest with you, as we've said, checks are still largely in use. My generation is not using checks as much as the previous generations. We just aren't. I know a lot of friends who have never written a check, and it's fascinating to me that these channels, despite that, are growing and growing and growing. I see a lot of young people on the fraud side. I see a lot of people who get roped into this under the age of 18 because once they're 18, they're out of jail. And that brings a lot of young people to these networks and provides growth, and then they spread it amongst their friends. A network could be started by a popular rapper, and that means that they now have 300,000 fans in that group starting fraud. It's like if Taylor Swift was doing check fraud. Your first thought would be, oh my God, there's so many people doing fraud now. So I think it's for a myriad of reasons that we're seeing this growth, but it's concerning.
Excellent. Let's look at the next slide. And I don't know if we want to jump into this one here right now. But James, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
I think, and if I think that we have a great understanding at this point of the rise in check fraud and the ecosystem of bad actors and how stolen checks are used to commit other types of fraud. So maybe we could dive a little bit more into how we can fight back. Like, what can financial institutions do to educate consumers about how check theft risks and prevention measures? Like, what can FIs start to do on this score?
Yeah, definitely. I think it all starts with awareness. So create awareness with the FI's customers, right? Provide awareness of safer ways to pay. Now, we all know every payment vehicle has its pluses and minuses, but being able to provide all the options to their customers so that they know how they can do that. Also, providing advice on what to do when you have to mail a payment. Going to the post office, go into the counter, because anytime mail sits in an unoccupied mailbox for any sense of time, it's a target, whether that's at your house or whether that's in a blue box on the street. So it's more stuff like that. Businesses can, some banks offer what they call positive pay services. So utilizing those services to reconcile those checks on a daily basis so that they know, it'll help identify the fraud quicker, and it'll also prevent some as well.
Excellent. And Cam, what are your thoughts in terms of protecting consumers and businesses against check fraud?
Yeah, I'm sure I'm going to be treading over a little bit of what James said here, but I think it's important to repeat. If you can, mail a check at a U.S. Postal Service branch. Don't leave the mailbox to chance. And that's not to discredit the fantastic surveillance and safeguarding work that's being done to minimize actual box theft, but in person is always going to be safer. If you're even able to deliver the check to its recipient in person, man to man, do that. I just signed a lease on a new apartment. It's the largest check for the security deposit and the first month's rent that I've written in my entire life. And I'm going right to the source. I'm going right to the office to drop it off. Because, while statistically the rate of check theft in my personal area is low, I don't want to take any chances on something like that. And I think that's a good, safe practice. And, obviously you can't just disregard checks in your life. You can't send a Venmo payment for medical bills that are hundreds of thousands of dollars. Checks are likely going to be part of our lives for a long time going forward. So anything you can do in a physical sense to keep security up is a good sense. And that's not to say that on the recipient end, there still isn't risk. There's always going to be risk of a check being stolen. Mm-hmm. But I think the more you can do to minimize it, the better.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about one of the answers to one of those earlier polls about kind of financial institutions working together. The fraudsters are collaborating. So what can financial institutions do to work together themselves to help fight fraud?
Well, it really comes down to a couple of main points. So again, going back to what I said in the beginning, the check payment world has not changed in multiple decades much. So the financial institutions are doing what they can with the tools that they have. So they're working with yesterday's technology to fight today's fraud. The other side of that is, there's a lot of barriers for financial institutions to share information with each other. So overcoming those barriers and implementing tech solutions that can evolve and are updated frequently to keep up with the fraudsters, because as long as the banks are doing better at preventing it, they're going to find a new vector to attack. So it's not something that can be easily stopped with one silver bullet and then never have to update again, because it's a constantly evolving process, even as Cam mentioned as well. And then also, using a bunch of layers of data and information to make that decision across the whole thing. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to overcoming those barriers, and consortium matters. The information sharing, because what the fraudsters will do is hit one bank, move to the next, move to the next, move to the next. If you take out that hub and stop it at one, and then everybody knows, all the institutions know about it, you have a better chance at preventing that fraud.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, there's a joke in the political world that every major issue can be solved with education, and that's kind of something that gets thrown around a lot, and everyone rolls their eyes. But I think in the cybersecurity and fraud prevention world, there's a similar catch-all answer, and that is collaboration. But not just between FIs, because there are barriers there. I think we need collaboration between the private sector, FIs, and government. And I think everyone putting their pieces together is really the only way that we're going to come out of this and reduce the number year over year of check fraud. No one has all the pieces.
Are there any sort of nascent efforts to kind of pull this kind of collaboration together between these different branches? Or is it we're still waiting for that to happen?
We're seeing the momentum for it to start, but you Cam touched on it, and you brought up a good point. The current regulatory landscape does need to change. It needs to be updated to match today's requirements. So there is drive. We've seen some letters, from senators coming out. So it's starting to get the attention and rise to that. But without those legal frameworks and protection for the institutions, it is currently a weak point in the industry as a whole.
Okay. All right. Okay. With that, let's do our last poll, and then we're going to open things up for questions with the audience. So, final poll here, everyone. What is the biggest hurdle internally for you to prioritize check fraud defense? Is it that internal priorities it's about internal priorities, that's not high enough on the list? Is it about having a limited budget, or is it a resource issue, or check fraud is not a significant problem at my FI, or is it something else? So also really great question. Very interested to see where people land on this one as well. And then, as I said, we will open things up to the audience for questions. And I see a lot of great questions coming in. I know that James and Cam were able to address some of the questions sort of along the way here. But, all right, let's see, where do we go here? Almost. Yep. Just about to. Let's go ahead and close it now. Thank you. Okay, so looks like resources tops the list. Almost 50% said that, and about a quarter have said internal priorities, make it not so high on the list. So that's interesting. And James, maybe I'll just ask you to comment on that. What do you think of those results just before we jump into seed questions? Jump into the questions from the audience.
It jives in line. As what seems to be the trend in the financial institution world and industry as large is do more with less. So a lot of times it comes down to literally we don't have the resources to implement that. So that's where partnering and getting the right providers or partners in there to help as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's see here. A lot of good questions in the queue. Let me ask you this first one. Do you expect fraud to go down as more people stop using checks? is that a trend that you would expect to start anytime soon?
Are we talking about assuming specifically check fraud?
Yes.
Because I don't expect fraud to go down, but
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. I misspoke.
Check fraud as a percentage, I don't see it going down.
Yep.
With the natural decline, the number may go down, but as a percentage, it's going to stay pretty steady, and it may even increase some, unless major changes enacted.
Gotcha.
I would have to agree. I don't really think it's a matter of how many checks are being written and used. Like I said, I think the newer generations are really not using them in the same way they have been in the past 20, 30 years. It's more so the methods that are available to fraudsters. And as the methods advance, the check fraud percentage is going to stay about the same, if not go up until we do something.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you for that. And let's see. So for businesses, isn't the positive pay system the highest? Oops, excuse me. I'm just kind of bounced around here. For businesses, isn't the positive pay system the highest form of preventative measure for check fraud?
If I'm correct, most small businesses don't have access to that. No?
I would say, yeah, it depends on the financial institution if they offer it, and if some of it's only for their large corporate or treasury clients. So there's a lot of difference in how it's implemented across the industry, but it is an important measure, but I don't think it's one of the most important, because there's still ways to get around that with like the example Cam mentioned with the Amazon Web Services. That check was made out to Amazon Web Services. The fraudster opened up an Amazon Web Services Inc. Positive Pay wouldn't have caught that because nothing was changed on the check. So it's different levels of, different layers of protection that need to be enacted.
Gotcha. And would you say that check fraud impacts business more than individuals?
I would say yes, and when you're talking about check fraud specifically, I would say yes, because the fact that there's more business checks being written than there are personal checks. So I think that's the driving factor on that being more impacted.
Gotcha.
And I think if we're just going on a numerical value, yes, it's going to impact the FIs more. But one thing that I see a lot and that really drives what I do and the passion behind it is when you see just your average person who has been impacted heavily in their life because a payment didn't go where it needed to go. So if we're talking pure numbers, yes, it's impacting the FIs more. But I think we do need to consider this and drive ourselves on the fact that in stopping check fraud, we are stopping lives from getting completely upended.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Lots of good questions coming in. So is it true that it's more difficult to wash a check filled out with ink as opposed to a ballpoint pen?
There are certain pens and inks that do resist washing, but that doesn't change a cooked check. So it doesn't even need to be the check document. It could be an image of the check that's digitally altered.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm no check fraudster, so I wouldn't know personally the efficiency of one ink versus the other. I'm assuming you're asking for a friend, but yeah, we are largely observing that cooking is the dominant method that's being advertised in these fraud groups.
Excellent. I noticed a bit of wariness in your answer there, Cam. Okay, so what is the pull towards still using checks if it is acknowledged that it is an old and lacking regulatory strategy?
The ubiquitous of it, the ease of businesses to use it. So with the fractured and open banking system that we have in the U.S., there hasn't been another method that is as ubiquitous as checks, right? And it also comes into the type of payment that the business is making. If I'm running a business, I may want to receive all of my payments immediately through ACH or real-time payments, FedNow, money coming in. But if I'm writing my tax bill or my expenses, my lease, I want that to be a check because it's going to take a little bit longer and there's more of a trail behind it. So I think that's it. Until we as a nation have a ubiquitous faster payments framework, we'll still see check use as pretty dominant.
All right, good. Thanks, James. So next question here, what is driving the dramatic increase in check fraud?
I think we're seeing a perfect storm of combinations, right? You've got the networks that have formed over the anonymity of the internet. You've got technology that has outpaced what the banks use. So you've got, fraudsters have the ability to even create a fake check document right on their computer and print it out if they need to have a paper copy. And then you have the economic situation with COVID and everything that happened from there that has just driven more people to go into this, and it's just created this perfect storm.
Yeah. All right, good. Let's see. Question here from someone, why is no one investigating and arresting these criminals? How do they continue to get away with these crimes?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it comes from, and this is sort of address a few of the other questions I've seen in chat, but I think a lot of it comes from the fact that not much is really being done about the networks themselves. Like we've hinted at, anyone who's been doing this for any amount of time can go into these groups, pinpoint who's behind them, and with enough time, get you a name. It's not a terribly difficult thing to do if you know your way around the networks and social media. Problem is, platforms like Facebook and Telegram aren't doing a ton. We occasionally see a message that's group was shut down for violating terms of service, group was shut down for copyright infringement, et cetera, et cetera. But at large, these groups are staying up for years. Not much is being done to take them down, and it's, I hate to say it, but they're just allowed to fester. And the check fraud's allowed to continue going on, and they advertise and they swap members to each other, and they just continue to grow. So I hate to shift the blame, but I think part of addressing that is putting the onus on companies like Facebook to shut these groups down when they pop up.
Do you also think that there's just too many of them to keep up?
I mean, look, in the past few years, we've seen a lot of these tech companies gut entire parts of their staff, like Meta in particular, as a result of their stock share price drop. There's been a ton of people gutted from internally there. So yes, we need more manpower, but to level with you, I'm not really sure it is a question of manpower wholly. I think it's a lot of the fact that they're just not getting looked at in the same way as other types of incriminating material such as CSAM or, more blatant stuff that's going on the platforms.
Interesting. All right, we are getting rapidly close to kind of the end of our hour session together, and I did want to, give James a final word and any last thoughts on, kind of key points that you want our listeners to go away with, or, that's sort of kind of final takeaways.
Well, I know first I want to say that, as much as we hate to say it, check fraud's not going away. So whether it's a, top of mind problem now or it will be. So being proactive about what your institution is doing to protect their customers, as well as their internal, losses. Other than that, it's really driving to push home the narrative that we need to start sharing information. We have to catch up to the fraudsters and start collaborating like they do. Otherwise, Cam said it best. It's going to take private, it's going to take government, it's going to take financial institution partnership to really address this problem and nail it home.
All right. I think that's a great note to end on. Really, I want to thank James and Cam, both you guys, for being here. Really important topic, and a great discussion. And of course, everyone in the audience, thank you so much for being here, for answering, participating in all these polls, and just an enormous number of questions that came in for James and Cam. We weren't able to get to all of them, but we'll be following up. So, thanks again for participating and asking those questions. And we'll also be sending you a follow-up email in the next day or two that will have a link to a recording of this event, so you can go back and listen to the highlights, and there were many. And with that, I will officially wrap it up. Wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day, and I hope you'll join us again here very soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.